Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Cybersecurity and How to Protect Canadian Agriculture from a Growing Challenge. My name is Cornelia Kreplin. In addition to being the interim CEO of the Canadian Agri-Food Automation and Intelligence Network, or CAIN as we call it, I have the pleasure of emceeing today's packed agenda. Before we start the formal portion of the event, CAIN acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, and we respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all the First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our communities and also our country. I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you a little bit about CAIN. We are a not-for-profit company that's funded principally by the federal government, and we're designed to support research and development as well as adoption of emerging technology in order to grow agriculture's contribution to the Canadian economy. We do that in three ways. We're developing a nationwide network of interested stakeholders and this network allows them to connect with each other to further their own interests. We are also supporting research and innovation through a project-based environment. And finally, we're supporting the adoption of technology through development of a nationwide network of smart farms. So on to the business at hand. Attendees will be muted throughout this webinar. So if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A widget that's below the session video feed, and the panelists will do their best to answer the questions. There's lots of time built into the agenda for you to take a quick check of what's happening in your email feeds or to take a quick bio break. And as I mentioned, we have a packed agenda, so I'd just like to kickstart this webinar and begin with our first speaker, who is Brennan Smith. Brennan is a published co-author of Cybersecurity Safe, Emergency Planning Beyond the Maginot Line, and an internationally renowned thought leader, professional speaker, media commentator, and workshop facilitator. He's an award-winning management consultant and seasoned media spokesperson on the topics of cybersecurity, emergency planning, and crisis response. Brennan has a passion for unlocking the conversation to bridge the gap between business and technology. His knowledge of agriculture-related issues stems from his rural Saskatchewan roots. A ProSci certified change practitioner, he also holds CompTIA Security Plus Cybersecurity designation. I'll rely on Brennan to tell you what that is. Brennan's keynote address is Cybersecurity. It's a big word, but what does it really mean? Will introduce us to the basics of cybersecurity, serving as a foundation to support us through the remainder of the day. Brennan, the screen is all yours.
As was mentioned in the very gracious introduction, I definitely have a passion for cybersecurity, and that really stems from my rural roots. And I have the rare fortune to be able to speak to cybersecurity and really help unlock the conversation and try to simplify it as much as possible. So it was mentioned a little earlier that there's ProSci and CompTIA as well. So just maybe a quick note on that and what that means. The ProSci certification is more so on the side of people and how that relates to the people side of change. And then when we talk about Security Plus, that's offered by CompTIA, and it really is just a way of making it so that folks are a little bit more well-versed in cybersecurity. So I hold those two designations, and it is certainly a passion of mine. And a lot of you may be asking the question, well, you have so many interests, Brennan, and you've spoken to a few different topics. Where does that come from? And I think I give credit to the fact that it's my rural roots, as was mentioned before. It really is something that is near and dear to my heart, but I think comes from that sort of agrarian creative spirit that we tend to hear about, especially in agriculture. And here's a bit of a view in terms of where I grew up. And so that's a little bit more of a modern view of where things are at. If you look really, really closely, there's a satellite dish on the top of the house there. And then the rest of the farm has remained relatively the same. The lands remain the same. But one thing that really has stood out here in terms of what's changed is just the general advice that we tend to remember hearing about. So as an example, I can remember here, and you'll see on the screen, livestock. Be careful around the livestock. Don't startle livestock. Just be very, very cognizant of where you're at. There's also the piece of watch out for the power lines and make sure that you're lowering the grain auger. And there's all these other pieces that I'm sure are coming to mind for you as well, if you think back to the kinds of things that you need to be conscious of when you're on the farm. Now, what was also interesting too, and part of where my story comes from, is this idea behind being careful around what my parents love to call the chat line. And that chat line was, of course, instant messaging, and it was brought to you by this magical thing called the 56K modem. And for those of a particular generation, I'm guessing that there's probably a few chuckles here that you can just hear the digging of the dial tone and recall that despite the speed, it was really a way of making it so that the world of opportunities was opened up. But when I think back to my story in particular and what brings us here today, there's a bit of a gatekeeper in terms of that world of possibilities. And it was this thing called the username and the password. And unfortunately, that username and password was known only to my parents. And so when the time came to connect to the internet, I soon discovered that I needed to have their permission in order to log on. And so each and every time that I needed to get access to the internet, I had to ask mom or dad. That was until the day that I had a lot of time on my hands, as elementary school students tend to have. And I decided to cruise through the C drive. And here's what I found. I found that there was a text document. And in that text document was a username and a password for a particular connection. That connection happened to be that 56K modem. So one day I decided that I would just input that information, type in the username, type in the password, hit connect, and boom, it worked. So at the time, I'm thinking, I'm going to be able to just do this as much as possible, and no one's going to find out. That was until the day that my mom was waiting for a phone call from a family member. And of course, if you're on dial-up, you can't get access to the telephone. It's one or the other. And so I was found out rather quickly when I'm sure my parents asked each other, did you go onto the internet? And it turns out both of them replied no. So as they would say, the gig was up. So you may be asking the question, why share that story? Well, I think the reason why it's so important for us to think back on stories like that is that despite the fact that we've made significant advances in technology and we've changed things, unfettered access to technology really has changed our lives. However, in the process of moving fast, we've lost sight of this whole idea behind safety and security. And that's what brings us here today, because what I want to do is I want to equip each of you that are joining us here with the ability to, after this session, and more importantly, after today's session as well, as far as the other speakers, I want to make sure that you feel equipped to engage in these types of conversations about cybersecurity, which is why we're going to be looking at today's presentation from 3 different areas. The first is going to be the fundamentals of cybersecurity. So this is going to be your basic, what does cybersecurity mean? What does it entail? Next, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be going through the challenges of today, and particularly what kind of challenges are being experienced by the agriculture technology sector? And last but not least, we're going to look at a bit of a point of view and a perspective that I'll share in terms of what kind of future cybersecurity considerations you might want to have when you start engaging in these conversations that will inevitably come up, especially as we have more technology adoption. So with that said, let's kick things off and make it so that you're equipped to know the cybersecurity fundamentals. But before starting, I just want to do a bit of a public service announcement here. And when we talk about cybersecurity, I want us to not necessarily think about quote unquote hackers, because we will hear a little bit later today that there are good hackers and they are here to actually serve us good and not inflict harm. Granted, there are those that want to do bad, but at the same time, let's make sure to call them as they are, which is threat actors or bad actors. So if you hear me make specific reference, or if you hear today about bad actors or threat actors, these are the people and institutions that we're talking about that really want to go against the grain, if you will, and just really afflict harm. So we talk a lot about cybersecurity, but as the title of today's presentation is, what does it mean? And this here is a representation of the definition provided by our friends south of the border, which is the art of protecting networks, devices, and data from unauthorized access or criminal use. Now, that definition in itself, I think, ends up standing well on its own. However, what we're going to do today is we're going to actually break that apart. And what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to show you the approach that I use in order to try to look beyond what's typically seen. So when I see, and when I hope you see definitions like this, especially when it comes to cybersecurity, that you see the idea of having art as the actual art or the craft of looking at evolving practices that need to be had at the back of our minds in order to help thwart actors that are bad. The other thing too that we need to pay attention to is information technology or IT and OT, which is operational technology. And we'll go through that in a little bit more detail here today too. The other thing is taking a look at the Internet of Things, which I'm sure we've heard a lot about. Some examples of those: connected lights, connected locks, connected doorbells. The list goes on and on. But there's also this component of operational technology, those things that control valves and that have supervisory control over things to see and monitor how pipes, as an example, are pressurized and whether or not things are flowing in the right direction or at the right temperature. All these things are important to consider because when we start thinking about access, we're going to see over the course of today that there's a broad spectrum of different things that we have to pay attention to when it comes to the whole notion behind not only just accessing data, but also the idea about changing or even destroying data, as we've heard a lot about in the news as of late. Now, what you're seeing here is a bit of a representation in terms of some numbers, because of course you got to have a little bit of quantitative analysis with these kinds of things. So here are, albeit a little bit dated figures here, but I think the point still stands that if you take a look here, cybersecurity is something that is a very, very costly endeavor if you find yourself subject to a breach. But the thing is, and that I want to set the context on today, is that none of the information that you're going to hear today is going to be predicated on the idea of fear. Instead, what I want you to do is I want you to feel empowered to be able to think about these things in a different way so that you can really help guide that conversation going forward as you head out into your daily work. Because when we think about it, if we look at the number 235, those are the numbers of reported incidents to the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity. The thing about reported incidents is that in a lot of cases, that number doesn't really go up because it means that folks need to be aware that something in fact happened. So that's really what we want to look at today. And you'll also notice here too on the left as well, is that there is that graph that shows a representation. Remember that piece about operational technology? You'll notice that operational technology is making up a wider swath of what things look like in the context of cybersecurity, which means that we're really going to have to pay attention to what that looks like. So I'm sure many of you who are scanning the slides previously, you probably saw CIA. We weren't talking about spies or that three-letter agency. Instead, we're talking about the building blocks of cybersecurity, which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Now we're going to go through some examples here of what each one of those means in a quick second here. But when you think about confidentiality, at the most basic of terms, think encryption, making it so that only authorized user or users are able to access something via disclosure. The second piece, of course, is integrity. And the other thing that you can think about when it comes to integrity is alteration. Is what I'm looking at something that is legitimate and hasn't been tampered with? That we're going to go through in a few slides from now in terms of what that might mean for the agriculture technology sector, especially when we start thinking about the wider adoption of technology. And last but not least is this whole idea of availability and making it so that things are not denied. The example that I'll share with you here in just a couple minutes is based off of some travels, because one thing that I absolutely love to do is travel about. And there's one example that jumped out to me in particular. But to zoom in a little bit, let's take a quick look at confidentiality. And I'll share just a quick story of what that means. So a little early on in the pandemic, there was the municipal election that took place. And what was kind of cool about the municipal election was that they offered the ability to provide your information in order to register as a voter. And I'm sure many of you were afforded that same opportunity. However, when it came time to actually circulating that information and providing it to the elections office, I kind of was a little bit apprehensive about that. And here's why. The PDF that I ended up sending was something that I added a password to, and it had some very, very basic protections for it. And the reason why I did that and why I secured it with a password is because I was a little bit worried about what that might mean if something were to ever happen to the emails of the elections office. Now, I don't say that to scare. Instead, what I want to do is I want to encourage you to think about some examples and some cases where you may be in a similar circumstance, and even doing something as simple as putting a password on a PDF, especially when there's sensitive information in there, that's really a quick win that you can help thwart bad actors. The second example, integrity. And this one, actually yesterday, it was kind of funny that this timing happened, but what ended up happening was that there was a QR code that was placed on the elevator lobby. And the thing about QR codes is that we're seeing news of some threat actors that are actually putting QR codes above legitimate QR codes that take you to falsified websites. And so when we think about integrity, the I in the CIA triad, it really is making sure that something hasn't been altered. So that is what integrity is about, as an example. The last one, and this one I think is a little bit of a fun example. I think you have to look at these things with a bit of humor. But I was in Washington, D.C. for business here in October. And I don't know, with that kind of travel, I always tend to take a look at different stories that come up. And so I was reading the news, and all of a sudden I came across this very interesting story where there was this case where they were going through and they were making some updates to the Rose Garden, and they were doing some landscaping. But as the quote here says, they discovered this mysterious cable that was accidentally cut. And it turns out that that cable happened to be tied to the military alert. And I'm sure at the time it was pretty serious business, and don't want to make light of that. But the reason why I share that story is because a little bit later, if we fast forward to today, we would hope that there would be some measures in place in order to prevent that from happening. But when we think about all these cases of potential fiber cuts, whether or not be through wildlife or let's say people that are putting in fence posts or what have you, there is a significant concern for something physically happening that could disrupt networks. So that's what's happening in the context of today's challenges. So if we were to tie a bow around what we just covered so far, we really seem to have this Cheeto lock of cybersecurity. And the joke, of course, comes from here that you wouldn't put a Cheeto as a lock, but really what we do is we tend to put these usernames and passwords in place that really don't fit the bill when it comes to securing some of these things that are just so vital to securing agriculture technology. And really, my point of view of this is that the state of cybersecurity, especially today, shouldn't really come as a surprise. Because just really quickly, if we take a look at just how far we've come, we started with literal horsepower, and then it ended up turning into steam. A short time later, we end up having these powerful pieces of equipment that are fueled and are ready to look at things at scale beyond measure. And of course, let's not forget, we also ended up innovating and we had things come from the sky and we had things like aerial spraying. Fast forward to today, we seem to be going back to that small concentrated effort, but in a little bit of a different context. We're seeing cases where we have drones that are autonomous and they're able to do precision spraying. Great for the environment, great for producers in terms of making it so that there's that concentrated focus. However, back to that example that I shared earlier in terms of have you been careful around the livestock? The modern day equivalent of what that looks like, in my view, is have you updated your software? And while that might sound like a little bit of a weird question to ask, I think it's important to note that there has been such a huge amount of change over such a short period of time. And the thing that comes to mind is that we have to really tackle this in a measured way, because the alternative isn't to just rip out the cords like what we typically see on LinkedIn. There might be some chuckles here in the audience because you may have seen this come across your feed. But in the worst case scenario, there is the disconnection to recover from cyber threats. But instead, what I think we need to do is shift the narrative. Instead of thinking about what could go wrong, let's look at what could go right. And that's what we're going to do right now. So just take a brief pause here because I want to set the context for what you're about to see in just a quick second. You may have heard of this thing called ChatGPT. It's all the rage. And what it is it's taking a look at information from the past number of years. And what it's doing is it's effectively pulling words together in order to come up with some pretty remarkable answers. You can put in a simple query that I'll show you in an example in a second, and it spits out some very fascinating things. But there's also some things that we need to keep in mind as these kinds of technologies come up. And so with that, I'll leave you with a little bit of a demonstration as part of what this means and just how easy things are to do with technologies like ChatGPT in 2023. As you watch this demonstration, it's only about 20 seconds or so, I really want you to think about this is a moment in time that you're watching this. As you're watching this unfold, think to what the horizon looks like over the next number of years. And what will go down is two paths. We'll go down a path where we are taking things in a measured approach. And then we'll also go down the path where we start seeing things a little bit less myopically and start thinking about the bigger picture. So without further ado, here's a bit of a demonstration of ChatGPT. You'll see here, it's a very simple interface. And what I did is in a very, very simple query, typed in these words, list the top cybersecurity threats to the agriculture sector in plain language. And then I hit respond. This it came up with on its own, and you'll see that it identified 5 key areas of focus. And I should mention too that I did this 3/4 of the way through completing this slide deck. But what was truly fascinating and also equally scary was the fact that it pretty much predicted all the things that I was going to touch on today. So I'm not saying that as someone who makes keynotes and is wondering whether or not there's potential replacement for keynotes because of AI. But what I am doing is I'm sharing this because in 2023, where we're talking today, this is really something that we need to pay attention to because it's completely disrupting what we're doing with things. And we're seeing things like unauthorized access to sensitive data, malware, and ransomware. Ransomware being that thing that encrypts data and you have to pay money in exchange for getting it back. Social engineering, where threat actors are impersonating, in some cases, people in order to try to get access to some sensitive systems. IoT, like what we talked about before, those Internet of Things, those vulnerabilities in those devices that we typically see. And of course, supply chain attacks as well. So the question becomes, what does this mean now and in the future? Well, as I mentioned, I like to be an optimist, and I hope that each one of you can leave today here being an optimist as well, because as we think about what the future of cybersecurity and especially the ag tech sector looks like, I think it's quite promising because we see that there is a difference in the level of visibility of where things are at. Again, we've got information technology. We're used to things like typing on a keyboard, using things like ChatGPT, which is artificial intelligence, as well as Internet of Things devices. But we also have, like I'd mentioned before, some things that fall a little bit under the radar that we still need to pay attention to, which includes operational technology, which is those things that control the equipment, less so the data, and things like robotic process automation, where we have specific things that are being done based off of, think of macros. And so specific things are completed in order. And of course, human-computer interaction. So the question of today, how promising is ag tech's future? I think the answer that we have is that it's very promising. Despite all these challenges, I think that we all have an opportunity here today, and I'm so excited to hear more from the other speakers, especially during our panel, is to think of using data as a competitive advantage so that technologies like ChatGPT and others can really help inform our decision-making. It's also something that we could really do to leverage these technologies so that we can compete through economies of scale. And of course, making it so that we can have ubiquitous broadband access through things like Starlink, making it so that folks are able to access speedy technologies. But the reason why I'm telling you this is because we need to remember one thing. Not everyone's operating at the same level. And especially the policymakers in the room today, I want to leave you with some specific pieces to ponder on. Because there are some barriers that I see that we need to address in the coming months and of course over the years, is just what things look like in the context of data control and distribution. Do producers and farmers have visibility into the kind of data that's being collected about them? That's something that I'm sure we'll be exploring in the coming session. The other question to think about too is the intensive operating costs that it has to have technologies in place to make this happen. And of course, the other important component too is municipal leadership and alignment on that front as well, making it so that we have less fragmentation of decision makers to make this a reality. So my view on this is, again, one of optimism. And I think that leading organizations are going to be providing what I did a blog post on, which is clarity, consistency, and visibility. Let's unpack that a little bit. So when it comes to providing clarity, it's going to make sure that we are being very, very clear of what kind of data is being collected and circulated, especially as we start thinking about some of these services that we're purchasing, whether or not it's a piece of hardware or if it's a particular piece of software. The other thing too is consistency. We had seen earlier that we have different municipalities that are very, very eager on delivering on these technologies. But the last thing we want to do is have a patchwork of systems. What we want to do instead is see if we can focus on interoperability. And last but not least is making sure that there is visibility. I think it's going to be of vital importance to make sure that there are numbers that are made available to everyone when it makes sense, of course, but providing visibility into what kind of measures are being realized as a result of this. So that's really what I think it is. And I think it's actually quite timely because I had the opportunity to hear some remarks from the Federal Ministry of Agriculture. And of course, there is the Guelph Statement. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the promise of the Guelph Statement, whereby we have the jurisdictions across Canada coming together in order to sign off on this. And when I think about what things pop out when it comes to agriculture technology in relation to the Guelph Statement, I see three key areas. I see science, research, and innovation. I see enhanced resiliency. And I also see that collaboration among stakeholders. And the question ultimately becomes, well, how do we make that happen? And I think you'll see at the bottom here that there's three different things that we can focus on. We can focus on leveraging artificial intelligence in a very focused and measured way. We can also put a very, very concerted effort into cybersecurity, which I think is just so exciting about what we're talking about here today and what you're going to hear about from our other speakers as well. And last but not least is the wide array and collection of Internet of Things and just how those can work in an interoperable way to just really help us. So I'll leave you with some final thoughts here. When we think about bureaucratizing imagination, this is something that I wrote about based off of a report that was released 20 or so years ago, which was actually the 9/11 report. It spoke about how we need to bureaucratize imagination. And why I think that's important is that when we think about things like a beaver chewing through a piece of fiber, and I kind of smile here at the mention of the beaver chewing through fiber. We saw a story about that in the news a little while ago. What it's important to remember is that we do have these unimaginable things that can happen, but we should do our best to try to get ahead of it. And the other thing too that we want to pay attention to as well is making sure that we do really take to heart this whole idea behind making sure that we pay attention to what kind of cybersecurity threats are on the horizon. Because cybersecurity really does mean the world to us, whether or not that means water security, whether that means food security, whether that means energy security, or last but not least, those physical pieces of security, which you'll hear about here when it comes to biosecurity. These are all very important points. Now, I know we have only a few more minutes left here, and I want to make sure that there's some opportunities here for discussion and some questions, but I want to leave you with a couple key learnings. And the first one is that if you take anything away from today's session, is that today's action, as much of a potential cliche as this is, today's actions are going to determine the future. And each of you, I think, are well poised to influence those decisions that can really help make for a positive future for producers when the time comes, especially as we think about technology adoption for those that are of a younger demographic. And the last piece too is that it's important to remain ahead of the curve. And in order to do so, I'll leave you with some three key actions to take. The first that I always share with folks is that you want to do an inventory of what it is that's important to you. And more importantly, what you think might be important to threat actors. If you do an inventory, it allows you to identify those items of importance so that you can then go through and start coming up with a risk register and identify those pieces that might have some potential hiccups so that you can figure out some safeguards of how to protect it or bring in those services to help do that for you. So with that in mind, I'd like to close by saying again, thank you so much to Kane and to the organizers for the invitation. I'm always available to connect here via email. If you want to subscribe to my newsletter, by all means, feel free to do so. It's listed here. And be sure to follow me on Twitter and on Instagram. So without further ado, I'll just exit the screen share here so that I can see the Q&A, but I'd like to open up the floor to questions. And so I see that there's two questions here. And the first one is the average age of farmers skews to an older demographic? How does that person who is learning about ag tech ensure that they're able to gain an understanding of security do's and don'ts? Are there resources? So as far as resources, that is a great question. And I think it's important to check out the fantastic resources by the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity. They've got a lot of really great stuff out there. In fact, that's where I got the numbers for the slides earlier on. And they do so in a very, very interesting way. And I say that because they write things in plain language, because I'll be the first to admit that there's a lot of jargon in cybersecurity, and they really, really simplify it. So that's a really great question. The other question as well is, what can ag tech manufacturers do to help their customers be more cyber secure? What I'd say about that is, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about that, but my view of this is that I think it's a competitive advantage. I'd be so bold as to say that for manufacturers, it's actually a competitive advantage to take a look at cybersecurity and to be absolutely concretely clear and provide that level of visibility to customers, saying that you are committed to cybersecurity. Because we know that there's an awful lot of information that's being collected. And the more and more we get into this whole service-oriented line of business, it affords much less opportunities for producers to get hands-on with technology, whether or not that's physically modifying devices. And I know that's a topic for discussion later when it comes to the whole notion behind right to repair. But more importantly, be very, very clear about what kind of data is being collected and just how much information your customers can use, and be very, very clear about what information you're using about them. Because if there is this use of data and it's being sold for other purposes, not only do I think that that presents an ethical challenge, but it's also something that I think is very, very disingenuous. And I think that leading companies are going to be those that are very, very focused on being very, very clear on that. So that's what I would say. So those are the two questions that popped up here. I'll mark those as answered live. Are there any other questions that come to mind here as you think about cybersecurity, especially when it comes to the basics? Just leave some time for folks to pop things into the chat. We got another question. Thank you so much. The question is, can we expect startup innovation to also nail down cybersecurity as they launch ag tech products? Great question. So in my view, I think what is going to be important, especially when we start thinking about incubators and when we start thinking about what stuff looks like for startups, is we're going to have conversations like infrastructure as code. What does that mean? Infrastructure code is actually a templated way of releasing specific services into the cloud. I think if you're able to ask that question as a startup and say, hey, is there a way for us to use infrastructure as code to make it so that we have templates so that we can roll out our infrastructure? I think that's actually going to become part of the business vernacular, in my opinion. The other thing that I think that we're also going to see too is that we're going to start seeing folks start to lean into this whole idea behind becoming a multi-cloud startup, making it so that we don't necessarily lock ourselves into a single provider of cloud technology, but instead make it so that things can be easily packaged and moved from cloud provider to cloud provider. Or if you want to hedge your bets a little bit, have it so that you have multiple cloud providers and offer those services in a cost-effective way that makes sense. So I think in short, really, when it comes down to startup innovation, I think that things like multi-cloud, product-first cloud development, those kinds of things should definitely be a part of the conversation. And feel free, included my contact information in my profile there. If you have any specific questions, I would be happy to provide more granular details to you. Absolutely. We have another question here. Could you share more on adding a password when sending an information item, such as the ballot example you gave? Absolutely. So as far as adding a password, we see a lot of different services that are out there. And not to pick on a particular product, but as an example, Microsoft 365 also offers the ability to encrypt your email. So what it does is it makes it so that if you have that functionality enabled, I actually use this more often than not, where I include a picture of something and I send it to the recipient. If they don't have that encryption as part of their technology, what they get is they get this little code and it sends it to their email. And it's just that additional measure that once they click on it, they're able to actually look at that encrypted message within their browser so that it's not going through just regular old email that could be unencrypted. So that's one example. The other one that I thought that I'd touch on quickly too is password managers. Password managers are something that I think are going to play an even larger role, especially when it comes to having organizations scale. And I think that if you do have the opportunity, and again, more opportunities to chat with me throughout the course of the day here, if you have more questions on this, but definitely recommend going with enterprise password managers, especially as we start thinking about things like APIs and tokens and all these kinds of certificates. It's all very, very complex stuff, but can be a lot easier to manage if there's things like key vaults and password managers. But thank you very much for the question. So yeah, it looks like there aren't any more questions. So again, I just want to say thank you so much for your questions, and special thank you to Kane for the invitation to speak to something that I am just so passionate about.
Just wanted to thank Brendan very much for a terrific way to kick off today's program. And as we will do with all the other speakers today, we're going to be able to make a donation in Brendan's name to a charity of his choice. And the same applies for all of our other speakers. So we'll give you a little bit of a break, maybe 5 minutes now before we begin our next session. Brendan is going to be chairing a panel that will talk to us about how technology is enabling improvements in Canada's agri-food sector. So we'll be back in just a couple of minutes.